Hello everyone, Snicked here. Idea Factory is not exactly a name that is associated with quality. Quite the opposite actually, they were pretty infamous, especially back in the 90s for producing some of the worst kusage around. Bad graphics, uninspired storylines, gameplay that just saps your will to live, the works. They have ideas alright, bad ones. Yaku Yujo Dangi, or Misfortune, a story of suspicious friendships, is certainly not going to convince you otherwise. It seems to be trying its hardest to be as unappealing as possible in every conceivable way. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that this is so obnoxiously terrible that it actually loops back around to being some kind of subversive, postmodern masterpiece. This was released in 1996 for the PSX, but it almost feels like a newer indie game masquerading as a lost artifact from the era. I mean, have you ever seen or heard of this game before now? I certainly hadn't. To be fair though, there's a good reason for this. It's a text-based adventure game, also known as a visual novel, that was never released outside of Japan. Only very recently did it become playable in English thanks to a fan translation. Yeah, somehow this game had a fan that was willing to translate it. Its characters are these hideous, malnourished abominations. They have bloodshot eyes with potato-skinned alien faces. Furthermore, they seem to exist in some kind of drug-induced nightmare world of abstract shapes and sounds, with incredibly repetitive music that gnaws away at your sanity. The beginning gives a pretty apt introduction. Welcome to the realm of nightmares. It's all deliberately uncanny in a way that creates a dissonance between the visuals and the actual story being told most of the time. This makes for a pretty good gag early on when Kana is talking about how much she likes Snick-kun and how handsome and awesome he is. And then it cuts to this creepy looking bastard. I take personal offense to this, I didn't know what I was signing up for when I was naming the protagonist. I should have really, considering his contorted face is right there in the background. This is possibly the only game in existence that lets you enter your name but doesn't actually have any kind of save system. There's only these passwords that are given to you at the end of each character's route. Not that you'll ever need them, this game is short enough to beat in one sitting anyway. The plot is about a group of friends showing up at their old school one evening to unearth a time capsule that they'd buried there before graduating. Things don't go as planned though, and they find themselves at the mercy of a revenge plot perpetrated by their old friend Yuichi, who has now become this psycho mad scientist. The same story is told from 5 different perspectives. The protagonist, Kana, Kyoko, Hideaki, and finally Yuichi. Only the first 2 are unlocked right from the get-go. The rest become available in a linear order as you progress through them. It sounds like a simple enough system for an adventure game, but somehow it managed to completely botch this. All the storylines run parallel to each other, and you're able to switch between them when given the option, which happens at an absurdly intrusive frequency. Read a bit of text, please choose a character. Read a bit more text, please choose a character. Watch a video, please choose a character. Read a single sentence, please choose a character. It just never stops asking if you would like to choose a character. This is known as the zapping mechanic, and it's meant to evoke the feeling of channel surfing at 2 AM or something. The entire game is presented as a broadcast on the fictional Idea Factory TV network, kind of like Catherine and the Golden Playhouse. This is why it likes to interrupt your regularly scheduled kusage with some ad bumper about saving the environment. It's so disconnected from anything in the story that it makes me think they were being sarcastic, but it's impossible to tell given the tone of this thing. Anyway, the whole zapping mechanic sounds cool on paper, but it doesn't work for a myriad of reasons. First of all, it isn't even true to its own motif. A TV doesn't constantly nag you if you would like to watch something more interesting, like it's an annoying spouse. And it's not like you can jump in and out of the different scenarios in the first place. They're not standalone stories, it's all one big interconnected story. What you're really being asked here is if you would like to jump into a random part of someone else's story with no context on where they are or what's going on. It makes much more sense to just pick one character and then stick with them all the way to the end. This will give you the most coherent telling of each of the routes. Zapping is just the objectively wrong thing to do at all times. and the game never stops interrupting itself to remind you about it. Please choose a character. It's like the game is extremely self-conscious about its own story becoming boring, but I assure you the other channels don't have anything good on either. It makes absolutely no sense to design it this way unless you were intentionally going out of your way to create the worst game ever. We'll return to that idea later. As you'd expect, each route is meant to shed more light on the overarching narrative. All of the POVs are first person, which allows us to get into the headspace of some of these characters. It's one of the few aspects of this game that I can say was done quite effectively, particularly early on when we switch POV to Kana. She's in love with the protagonist and is always interpreting everything he says in the best possible light. Even the stupid things, like when he tells her to go see a therapist. I was actually very surprised to see all the dialogue options that I chose in the Protags route remain consistent across Kanas. This led me to believe that the game was more sophisticated than it actually was with your choices, but they only lined up like this by sheer coincidence. I played through this game again just to make sure. These choices are your means of influencing the story, but only in small, self-contained ways. Only the choices you make right before the end actually change which ending you get. This is, perhaps deliberately, not made very clear to the player. No matter which story you choose to view, the timeline always advances forward by one scene. Once you reach the end, the timeline on all routes is reset back to the beginning, leaving you with no choice but to replay the entire thing again if you want to choose something different. You can work around this using save states, but this wouldn't have been an option on actual hardware, of course. This bizarre structure is the main reason, I suspect, that your choices don't matter a whole lot. If they did, they would have to change things beyond the short, isolated scenes in which they appear. But since you can skip these scenes entirely, the game would have no choice but to randomly splinter the story in different directions without the player's input. In other words, it's a problem that only exists because of its ill-conceived story structure that it's inexplicably enamored with. Earlier I said that the routes are meant to shed more light on the overarching narrative. The key word here, though, was meant, since that's usually how it works in other visual novels with a similar structure. Take Ever 17, for example, or if that's too much of a boomer reference for you, Little Busters? Oh crap, that's also really old. Whatever ironic flavour of the month VN that is currently in vogue whenever you watch this. Barring this, a VN can use its character-specific routes to reveal more information about them. Even if we're not advancing the main plot, we're at least still seeing new dimensions to the characters that can have interesting implications. Misfortune fails to do either of these approaches properly though. It barely has enough story to justify one route, let alone 5. The one you'll probably start with, the Protags route, has all of the most important plot points, and the rest just feel like filler. Kana's route doesn't bring any new information to the table besides explaining that this random hairdresser is actually a ghost. But considering his presence as a complete non sequitur to begin with, this doesn't add a whole lot. It's like they realised the story wasn't long enough, so threw in some random spooky side events to pad out its length. Kyoko ends up getting experimented on and put into the body of this purple pig monster. Basically the Aoni. This is something that's already revealed in Kana's route, so we don't learn a whole lot of new information here, besides from some small details, like who started the fire at the end of the Protags route. This one is more of an attempt at Hideshi Hino style body horror story where we see Kyoko slowly devolve into something inhuman, both in mind and body. It's Misfortune though, so the execution isn't terribly interesting. It's basically just her walking around and occasionally eating bugs. She gets kinda depressed at the end and decides to blow up the entire school. Now, I didn't just mention Hideshi Hino a moment ago just to signal my horror otaku street cred. It's quite obvious that his work was a significant influence on this game's whole vibe, aesthetic, and even story. Indeed, the developers would even recruit the maestro himself to work on this game's sequel, which I imagine is what they wanted to do the first time around. This game hasn't been translated, but from what I've read, it sounds interesting. Not good, but definitely interesting. Apparently it's some sort of meta-commentary on the first game. At any rate, reading at least one of Hideshi Hino's mangas really puts into perspective what they were going for here. He likes to create these twisted mockeries of the human form to emphasize their ugliest traits. In Misfortune, we see this not just with Kyoko, but with Hideaki as well. In revenge for years of bullying, Yuichi turns him into a slave that can't think or act for himself. If you try to defy him, you get the text, "Slaves cannot make choices." Aside from this memorable gag though, this is probably the least interesting route of the bunch. It's just him walking around and not doing much of anything until the ending. This is another problem with this game's structure, by the way. Since all of the routes have to be synced up with each other, there's a lot of dead air where nothing of note is happening. It's like being on the wrong channel in Night Trap, and I can't believe I'm referencing that. You can even end up watching the same animation on loop 2 or 3 times before the story actually resumes. If it really wanted to be a horror story inspired by the works of Hideshi Hino, it sure goes about it in an unorthodox way. They seem to have missed the main ingredient, the actual horror part. There's no violence or disturbing imagery at all beyond what would be acceptable in a children's show. I think someone probably looked at this at some point in development and thought it was lacking a certain something. Some kind of edge that would elevate it above a failed attempt at mimicking a prolific horror mangaka. This is where the final route comes in, which is focused exclusively on the game's main villain, Yuichi. Unlike the other routes though, it isn't taking place from his perspective. This becomes immediately obvious when he breaks the fourth wall to address you, the player, and declares that all of the endings that you have witnessed up till now are bullshit. The true ending can only be found if you can answer the question that's at the root of this entire mystery. What did he write in the time capsule 6 years ago? If you've been paying attention to the plot at all, you probably already have a pretty good theory on this, especially since his motives narrow it down quite a bit. The Hideaki route in particular points towards the others bullying him, the extent of which is unclear, but definitely seems disproportionate to his grudge. Did he wish for everyone to die? Did he curse everyone? Did he hope for everyone to just get along? Did he hope for forgiveness? Did he hope for it all to end, and for everyone to stop lying? The wrong answer will lead you to a bad ending that will force you to play through all of Yuichi's scenario again to have another chance. Logic dictates that everything we've learned in the scenarios up till now holds a clue for the answer. You might even be tempted to play through the entire story again until you figure it out. I know I certainly did. But I'm going to save you some time right now by revealing the answer. It's all a deliberate red herring that preys on your expectations of what the game is supposed to be. A solvable problem. Before getting into how Misfortune subverts this, I want to bring up someone I've already talked about on this channel before. Ryukishi7, the creator of Higurashi, Umineko, and soon to be the first good Silent Hill game in 2 decades. Back in my Higurashi video, I spoke about how his work is very rewarding to engage with as a sort of puzzle. If you put in the time and energy to analyse all the hints he's been giving you, you may arrive at the answers before the story itself reveals them. And it does eventually reveal them in rather spectacular fashion. But to do that, the reader first needs to extend him one thing: their trust. They need to have faith that this quirky writer isn't just wasting their time with a wild goose chase. This is actually a large part of his second major work with Umineko, which is all about this unspoken cooperation between reader and writer. It's this bond that ultimately allows the story to be a compelling mystery. A similar thing can be found in all video games though. When you play them, you're putting your trust in the designer that everything is fair and beatable. Because if it isn't, you're just wasting your time. Not a lot of good can come from violating this implicit trust for either party really. It just creates an unpleasant experience. It would take a real dishonourable villain to do this intentionally. They would have to be the scum of the earth, like Yuichi. Yes, as you've probably already surmised, there is no correct answer to his question at the end of the game. They all lead to a bad ending that has you wondering where you went wrong. It was all orchestrated this way as a deliberate waste of time. Yuichi isn't just some bullied kid out for revenge as the story suggests. He represents something much more than that goes beyond the game itself. This is why he breaks the fourth wall to involve the player. He embodies the collective rage of all malcontents and social outcasts. There is no correct answer to Yuichi's question because it never mattered in the first place. It was all just an excuse so the plot could happen. The fiction of the game was a trap to lure in the true target of his revenge. Us, the foolish consumer that bought this game or at least invested their time into it. This is heavily implied by the way he keeps reminding us that this is just a story that has absolutely nothing to do with us, which feels like an oddly specific denial. It has everything to do with us because the story only exists to entertain us. He would never outright admit this though, because that would give up the game. We would stop playing and stop thinking about its story, which is the entire point of his revenge. Instead, he maintains the illusion that its narrative has any importance whatsoever. He makes you a sort of accomplice to his crimes as a sneaky, indirect way of saying that you're the only reason they're happening. He prods the player with questions like, "Are you enjoying this?" as if the game itself is only begrudgingly giving them the horror content that they paid for. He's a developer's own twisted take on Hideshi Hino. Not the mangaka himself though, the semi-autobiographical caricature of him that sometimes narrates his work. Like Yuichi, he too is known to break the fourth wall to pull the reader into the horror. That relationship I talked about between player and developer, reader and writer is once again put under a microscope. Only here it's for a much more malicious purpose. It isn't trying to cooperate with you to create a memorable experience, it is actively trying to be as unpleasant and mean-spirited as possible. Misfortune is a game that knows it's bad. It knows it's destined to be hated and maligned by its player base and has decided to preemptively hate them in return. It takes advantage of their desire for closure to trap them in this insane nightmare world where the same senseless tragedy repeats over and over again. Its artistic pareidolia weaponized as a figurative hamster wheel that keeps us running in place, forever chasing after the meaning in the meaninglessness. Yuichi didn't just turn Hideaki into a slave, he also did the same to us, only we didn't realize until it was already too late. Perhaps this was its own unique way of evoking a sense of helpless, existential terror, and to that end, I must admit that it was somewhat successful. But it could just as easily be the unhinged, nihilistic ravings of some deranged Japanese programmer. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between these two. In either case though, it's not a truth we were ever meant to reach. Thinking about Misfortune is to be cast back down into its purgatory. This is why Yuichi goads you into giving the game a bad review and slating it to your friends. It feeds on that negativity that propagates itself. And I've unfortunately fallen for it hook, line and sinker by making this video. Some of you may even be thinking about playing it now because of how I've presented it here. But please let me warn you one last time. Only misfortune awaits you in Yuichi's nightmare prison. Because this is a game that hates you. As usual, a special shout out to my channel members and patrons. Another game with an underage serial killer named Yuichi, how about that? Anyway, I've been Snickety Slice, I'll see you around.